Welcome, welcome everybody. Can you all hear me? Welcome to the inaugural John B. Paine Jr. annual lecture on business history and innovation. It's a delight to see you all here. Dad would be thrilled to see you all here. Now, back when he was a treasurer of Mass Historical Society, this is in the 50s and 60s, and I was a high school student, my first memory of Mass Historical was sitting right over there next to that back window at a table organizing the papers of Senator George Frisbee Hoare. Back in those days, they often had evening gatherings, and similar to what we have today, but back then, let me tell you, they came in black tie. So Tom Adams, the president, and Rommel would have a group coming in from Lincoln to have a dinner out in Lincoln, come into a wonderful talk here. And likewise at my house, where I grew up, Jack and Rita Paine, I should say I'm Tom Paine, Jack Paine's son, I forgot to say that, would have a similar dinner before coming into a meeting here. And they'd all come in here and they'd hear an illustrious speakers, such as we have tonight, for instance, Barbara Tuchman or people like that. And they were dressed in black tie and long dresses and so on. But for Dad, I think the most memorable event that he ever went to caught him completely by surprise. This is on the occasion of the 175th anniversary of the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1966. It was held at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And so the assembled members, I think it was mostly members-only event, all around the table were wondering what Thomas Boylston Adams, the president, was going to speak about, what sort of weighty historical subject was on his mind to talk about on such a grand occasion. But instead, Tom Adams spoke the entire time extolling the incredible job that Jack Paine had done as treasurer of the Massachusetts Historical Society, turning around his lackluster performance of 10 years before into stellar results, doubling the corpus, doubling the income, and basically saying, Jack Paine is the finest treasurer we've ever had, bar none. At this point, Dad must have been blushing crimson. And then everybody in the room gets on their feet and gives him a standing ovation. So who was this guy, this modest treasurer of the Massachusetts Historical Society? Well, at age 27, back in 1929, he went to work one day, October 24th, 1929, into his job at Spencer Trask, and all of his colleagues there were saying, oh, it's going to be another fantastic rally day. And he said, nothing doing. And he sold out, and he was the only one doing that there. And so he predicted the crash, and that basically made his reputation. He was thinking for himself. So very soon after that, he founded his own firm, as an investment counsel firm, what we would today call a socially responsible investor. In other words, he wanted nothing to do with profiteer companies, the tobacco companies, the oil companies, the munitions companies. I can distinctly remember conversations about Dow Chemical, purveyor of napalm, back in the 60s. So that's the kind of person he was. And so it seemed to honor this independent, his interest in socially responsible investing, not profiteering, just decent profits for decent causes, advancing American society. The proper way to honor this guy, my dad, Lynn, and I thought, was to create a program at an institution he loved and spent so much of his time being a part of, the Massachusetts Historical Society, and creating an annual lecture series on business history and innovation. He would be just so proud to be, he'd be embarrassed actually to be here and seeing you all. So thank you, staff of the Mass Historical Society, for all you've done. Thank you, illustrious speakers, for being here tonight. And thank you, everybody else in the audience, for coming to this inaugural event. And with that, I will turn the program over to Brenda. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Tom, and thank you to you and Lynn for your generous endowment of the Paine Annual Lecture on the History of Business and Innovation. We are grateful for the Paine family's long and loyal friendship to the MHS and their commitment to ensuring the future longevity of the Society and our ability to offer wonderful programs like this one. So Tom and Lynn, thank you. So for those who don't know me, my name is Brenda Lawson. I am the interim president of the Massachusetts Historical Society, and it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for the evening. At the MHS, our rich collection of records from business and industry throughout the centuries paint a vivid portrait of how financial markets shaped the world we know. As many historians will tell you, the economic factors at play are often key to understanding how pivotal moments in our nation's past came to fruition. This evening, we are honored to be joined by David Rubenstein, a trusted voice in the financial world and a renowned collector and supporter of American history. David is the co-founder and co-chairman of the Carlyle Group, one of the largest and most successful private investment firms, and chairman and CEO of the Baltimore Orioles Major League Baseball team. A hand even from Red Sox fans. A recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, David is the chairman of the boards of the Council on Foreign Relations, the National Gallery of Art, and the University of Chicago, among many other nonprofit leadership roles and philanthropic endeavors, too many to list. He is the author of several best-selling books on investment, American history, and leadership, including How to Invest, Masters on the Craft. Joining David in conversation is Dr. Lizabeth Cohen, the Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of History, and the Howard Mumford Jones Professor of American Studies. Liz is a two-time winner of the Bancroft Prize and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for his book, Making a New Deal, Industrial Workers in Chicago, 1919 to 1939. Among many awards and honors, she has been a fellow of the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the American Council of Learned Societies. Thank you, David and Liz, for joining us for what is sure to be a fascinating conversation. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brenda, and thank you, Tom. And it's a great honor to be part of this inaugural lecture, and also just a great pleasure to be here today talking to David and having the opportunity to turn the tables on him and subject him to an interview, given that he is usually the one doing the interview, whether it's on the stage of the New York Historical Society or Bloomberg on TV or in print. So I've been looking forward to this, and I've also been looking forward to congratulating you on having received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Biden in early January.
Thank you.
In recognition of your many philanthropic contributions, a very well-deserved honor. But then just a few days ago, I learned that condolences are due as well, as we all learned that you have been fired as chair of the Kennedy Center Board by President Trump. So it's been a pretty intense month for you with both recognition and rejection. So let me just ask you, before we dig into the business at hand, whether there's anything you'd like to say about either or both experiences.
Well, I've resisted any comment on the latter for a number of reasons, but I would just, so people know what the Kennedy Center is. When this country was created, George Washington said, if we're going to be a national capital that's meaningful, we have to have a cultural center, performing arts center. So he asked Pierre L'Enfant to draft up a national cultural center as part of the original design of Washington. And he did, and then they ran out of money, and then Pierre L'Enfant got fired. And so they didn't actually build a National Cultural Center. And so entrepreneurs would build their own theaters, the most famous of which was Ford's Theater, right. But there were many of those. In the early part of the 20th century, an effort to revive a National Cultural Center began in the United States, in Washington. But many people were worried that if they did it, it'd have to be integrated. And therefore, there was resistance by Southern members. In 1958, legislation finally passed. John Kennedy was a member of Congress. He supported it, and Eisenhower signed it. And the idea was it would be built in Washington, a National Cultural Center, and what would happen is it would be paid for by citizens, no money from the federal government. So Eisenhower had some people try to raise money, and after 3 years, 58, 59, and 60, they raised a net total of $13,000. Not enough. So President Kennedy came in, and he liked the performing arts, and he said, all right, I'm going to be serious about raising money. And so what happened is he got a man named Roger Stevens, who was both a smart man in real estate, businessman, but also a Broadway producer. And he asked Roger Stevens to come in and get it done. And so they started having national telethons, and Leonard Bernstein conducted many of them. And one time he said, you know, a friend of mine said I should trot out this young kid who's a really young performing artist, is really good. And here he is. And he brought out a 7-year-old named Yo-Yo Ma. He was pretty good. But tragically, President Kennedy was killed on November 22nd, 1963. I think everybody here probably remembers exactly where they were. His family said, we want to have a living memorial, not just a Washington Monument kind of thing, a living memorial. They decided to take the National Cultural Center, and it was renamed by Congress the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. And so it was built at typical Washington. It was agreed to in '64 and opened in '71. It took a while. But it's a gigantic building, and the architect was an architect that Jackie Kennedy really liked, and Edward Durrell Stone. So now there are 36 people appointed to the board by President of the United States. It's a very bipartisan thing, and I've been the chair for 14 years, which is probably too long. I tried to step down at the end of December, saying 14 years is enough. I've given $120 million at the Kennedy Center, which is a lot of money for performing arts, right? So, but I had one or two more projects I was working on, but I said I would step down. And there was some person who was ready to be the chair, but this person was very close to Biden and Kamala Harris. And when President Trump won, the person just said, I just don't want to do it. So the board came to me and said, stay 2 more years. And so I agreed to do that. The events of the last couple of days, I'm not going to comment on publicly for a number of reasons, but I would just say, if any of you ever get a chance to go to the Kennedy Center, take advantage of it. We've built some additions to it that I helped get done, and we have a couple more things that are in the works, and it's a great National Performing Arts Center. So if anybody, have you ever been to it? Anybody? Okay, so it's a great thing, and I am enamored with John Kennedy. I was a little boy when he was running for president, and he drove by a street near my house, and I went to see him, and he was waving. I knew he was waving at me, so I waved back. And then I've now, I think, given more money to things named after President Kennedy than anybody in America. So I'm the biggest donor to the Kennedy School at Harvard, and to the Kennedy Library and the Kennedy Center. And I just thought he was a great president and great son of Massachusetts, and I'm sure all of you probably know more about him than probably I do.
Okay, well, thank you. Now let's get down to business.
Okay, go ahead.
I noticed that in your book, you begin almost all your interviews by requesting that the interviewee tell you a bit about their own history. You often ask them the question, did you always want to be an investor when you were a child? And I would also note that, and it's something I want to ask you a little bit more about, that you've recognized that many of the people, if not most of the people you interviewed, had come from working class or middle class backgrounds in growing up. So I'm going to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about your own history. I gather you were not raised in a family of investors. So I'm wondering what experiences growing up in Baltimore may have influenced the path you eventually took, and why do you think that it has mattered that many of these people you have focused on in the book did in fact grow up with middle class or working class backgrounds?
Well, if you're the son or daughter of an extremely wealthy person, it's very difficult, not always impossible, but always difficult to have the motivation, the drive to go and make another $1 billion, another $2 billion, or whatever it is. So, the greatest investors are generally people that have a drive, and I'll go through the other characteristics in a moment, but you have a drive that you typically get when you want to achieve something and your father or mother didn't give it to you. The same is true in professional athletes. I did an event last night with Ken Burns at the New York Historical, and we were going through all the famous baseball players who had sons that were not very good baseball players. Ted Williams, Joe DiMaggio, Willie Mays, Mickey Mantle, none of their sons were anything in terms of great baseball players. With the exception of Barry Bonds, who was the son of Bobby Bonds, and the exception of Ken Griffey Jr., son of Ken Griffey, there haven't been any great baseball players that were really the sons of great players. The same is true in the investment world. As a general rule of thumb, you wouldn't expect Warren Buffett's children to be great investors. He's single-mindedly focused on it, and his kids wanted to do other things. In fact, they were so focused on different things, none of them graduated from college. 3 children, none of them graduated from college. So, in my case, my parents had no college degree or high school degree. My parents dropped out of high school to get married. I was born more than 9 months later. And my father, after he came back from World War II, worked completely at the post office as a blue-collar filer of mail or something like that. And I had no money. But in hindsight, it's a great thing. Because if you grow up knowing you don't have money or anything to fall back on, you're more likely to be driven. You're more likely to say, I got to do this on my own, and you develop skills. If you know you can always fall back on your parents, you're not likely to be driven. Now, there are obviously a lot of wealthy kids who are driven, but as a normal course of history, you'll see the most driven people come from lower class or middle class backgrounds. And that's in the case. In my case, that's what happened. So I went to public schools and got scholarships to Duke University, not a basketball one, I assure you, and University of Chicago Law School. And I went to work for Ted Sorensen at a large firm in New York, because he was the man who wrote the great inaugural address. I'm sure you're all familiar with this address. It was a brilliant address, the best, I think, inaugural address of the 20th century. And I thought some of his pixie dust would rub off on me, and he finally figured out I wasn't that good a lawyer pretty quickly. So he helped me get a job in Washington, which was what I wanted anyway, and I wanted to work in the White House like he did. I didn't want to say and coast the rest of my life on the reputation I had as a 30-year-old, but it's my idea. So I got a job working for a man who was running for president. I thought he was very talented. I was chief counsel for a man named Birch Bayh, running in President of the United States in 1976, a liberal from a conservative state. But he had to drop out because in Massachusetts, he came in 6th behind the anti-abortion candidate. He was so unpopular, he didn't do so well, he had to drop out. The anti-abortion candidate in Massachusetts beat him, among other people who beat him. So then I got a call from somebody saying, would you like to work for another guy running for president? I said, who was that? I said, Jimmy Carter. I said, he's not going to be president. He's the peanut farmer, right? Yes. One thing I know is he's not going to be president of the United States. So, but I had nothing to do, got the job. I joined Carter in the general election campaign. Carter won the election by he was 34 points ahead when I joined, and he won by 1 point. So he said to me, like, what did you really do? Because I was 34 points ahead before you showed up, and now I only won by 1 point. But as we have learned many times, sadly, White House staffs are filled on who worked in the campaign, not on merit. So at 27 years old, I'm the Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor to the President of the United States, a job I wasn't qualified for. I didn't think Carter was that qualified either. He didn't know anything. I didn't know anything. I managed to get inflation to 19%, a record that still stands. And so we lost the election. I remember telling Carter, Mr. President, you have no chance of losing to Ronald Reagan. He's 69 years old. He's too old to get out of the bed in the morning. You can't possibly lose to him. I'm now 75. So 69 seems like a teenager to me now. We'd love to have a president who's only 69. But at the 69, he seemed too old to me at that time. So I was wrong, and I got out of it and went ultimately back to practice law, and then I started an investment firm.
Okay, anything you want to just say about Baltimore, growing up in that city, and how that might have affected you? It's an interesting
Baltimore
city.
was different than Boston. Baltimore was a blue-collar town from the beginning. Boston, you could argue, is not as much of a blue-collar town, given all the universities and other academic things you have here. Baltimore was, at the time, the 8th biggest city in the United States. It's hard to believe, but it was 939,000 people. And 9th biggest now, it's not even in the top 20. The corporate headquarters have all moved. The city, the whites have basically moved out of the city. It's now a 63% black city. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And has a lot of high crime, has a lot of other problems and urban areas have. But I was growing up there. It was the city I grew up in. So all of you grew up in some city. You didn't say, I wish I was in some other city. You take as what's given to you, and you just live with it. So Baltimore was a rigidly segregated city. Some of you may, or if you're lawyers, will know that in 1948, in a case called Shelley v. Kramer, the United States Supreme Court said you can't have restrictive covenants. Restrictive covenants means you can't say on a mortgage, you can't settle a black or a Jew. That was outlawed in 1948. Baltimore never got the word. And as a result, the basically restrictive covenants were still effectively used. So if you were Jewish, you had to live in a certain area. And I was 13 before I realized everybody isn't Jewish. I didn't know anybody wasn't Jewish. And later I realized virtually nobody's Jewish. But, 2% of the population. But in those days, I knew everybody I knew was Jewish. And it was a Jewish ghetto, blue-collar Jewish ghetto. I grew up in a house, 800 square feet, one bathroom, no air conditioning, no backyard. And that's, you got used to it. And so I decided to get back on the Orioles to finish that point. I have given away, I signed it, I was an early signer of the Giving Pledge, one of the original 40, and I decided that I give away a lot of money in different things I care about. I hadn't done as much for Baltimore, the hometown that I grew up in. That gave me a public education. My parents were born there, they were raised there, married there, and they're buried there, and I'll be buried in Baltimore too. I just said, I got to do more for Baltimore. I'd given a lot of money to Johns Hopkins, but I just thought I would do more, so that's why as a philanthropic gesture, I kind of bought the Orioles. I don't want to lose money. I don't want to lose money. And this weekend I had lunch with John Henry and Linda Henry in Florida. I know the owners here of the Boston Red Sox, and I like to have 4 World Series myself, but Orioles haven't won since 1983. We have a long way to go, but it's enjoyable. It's great when you win, and it's a dagger in your heart when you lose. It's terrible.
You anticipated one of my questions was going to be whether buying the Orioles was a philanthropic or a business decision, and I think we got our answer.
Look, the Orioles came to Baltimore in 1954. The purchase price was $2.2 million. I paid $1.7 billion, a little bit more. And the previous owner was the Angelos family. They had bought it in they bought it in around about 30 years earlier. They bought it. And in 30 years, they became relatively unpopular in Baltimore, rightly or wrongly. The team hadn't done that well. It hadn't gone to a World Series in the time they were owning it. And so when I came in, I said I would try to be more involved with the fan base. So I would go to the games, throw out hats to the fans, jump on the dugout, and do all the promotional stuff that, I thought an owner should do. And I try to revive the spirit of the Orioles, because the Orioles, Baltimore doesn't have a lot going for it. The Colts moved out. They moved to Indianapolis years ago. The hockey team moved to Washington. The basketball team moved to Washington. The Orioles haven't won a World Series since 1983. And all the corporate headquarters are gone. So Baltimore is the Orioles are the spirit of Baltimore. If they do well, it energizes the city in a way that nothing else does, because there's not a lot of other things in Baltimore. So I thought if I could energize the Orioles, and they do reasonably well, I'll be okay. But now the way baseball works is you give you a honeymoon the first year, and I had a honeymoon. People didn't criticize me that much, but they said, in the off season, you didn't sign up these players. Why don't you pay $500 million for this player? Why don't you pay $700 million for this player? Well, some of these things may not be economic. So, my honeymoon may be over. We'll see.
Well, we know what it's like to wait a long time to win. So it can happen. So
You know why you waited a long time?
why is that?
The curse of the Bambino. Everybody's familiar with
Yes,
that.
right.
Okay. What actually happened was Babe Ruth, who's from Baltimore, born 1895 in Baltimore, he basically played for the Orioles in minor league, came to Boston. And the owner of the Boston franchise had some expensive tastes, and he had to fund a Broadway play, Nana and Nat, I think it was called. And so he had to get some money, also to pay for some girlfriends he had. And so he sold Babe Ruth for, I think, $100,000. It was paid over, I think, 2 or 3 installments. But the real problem they had was not selling Babe Ruth. The reason that the Red Sox had some problems, they were the last team in Major League Baseball to integrate. They gave a tryout to Jackie Robinson, and he was seen to be not good enough. And they gave a tryout to a guy named Willie Mays, and he wasn't thought to be good enough either. I did a film for PBS on Fenway Park. It's a great stadium. But when I did it, I did the history of it, and I realized had they integrated earlier, they would have been a better team. How many people here know who was the first African-American who played for the Red Sox? Pumpsie Green, right. Is he in the Hall of Fame? No, Willie Mays would have been better, right? Okay.
Okay, well, so I couldn't help but notice that at Duke you were a political science major, and then you went to the University of Chicago Law School. And so I am interested, and I think our audience may be as well, in how it is you got interested in history. You've bought, purchased major historical documents. For the audience, if you don't know, the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, Emancipation Proclamation. You have given support to historical monuments, Washington Memorial, Jefferson Memorial, Lincoln Memorial, the National Archives, the Smithsonian, homes of presidents, and I could go on. I should say that as an historian, I'm happy to have late bloomers like you in the field, but tell us, how is it that you came to history?
Well, I lived in Washington now for 50 years practically, so you live in the city, which for an American city, Washington is old, not for a European city. So you see these monuments all the time, and I worked in the White House, and there's very few things that are more historic than working in the White House. But what happened was, if I had hired McKinsey and say, what's a good way that I can give back to the country for my good fortune, they would probably give me a lot of things, but I'm not sure that would have had the same connection with me. Like many things in life, it happened by serendipity. Think about this. Those of you who are married, what's the serendipity event that enabled you to meet your spouse? Was it you went to an event, and if you hadn't gone to that event, would you have met your spouse? You might not have. Or your job you might have. If you hadn't met somebody who got you an interview, you might be in a different career. So you never can predict where it's going to happen. An investment banker sent me a letter saying, why don't you come to a viewing of the Magna Carta in New York? The Magna Carta was not of that much interest to me. It was across the street in the National Archives. I never visited. But I said, okay, I'm going to be in New York anyway. I'll go visit it. I go there, and very cleverly they said, well, actually, it's on display here because Ross Perot owns it. It's the only one in private hands and the only one in America. But it's going to be sold tomorrow in an auction to either somebody from Russia or Saudi Arabia or Libya or someplace like that. I said, geez, that's not good. So I decided I'll go buy it the next night. Now, I didn't tell anybody I'm going to buy it. It sounds presumptuous to say I'm going to go buy the Magna Carta. So, and I didn't want to tell my children. They say, how much less money might this mean? So I went the next night, and I'd never been to Sotheby's before. And I said, well, where do I raise my hand and all that? And then go into this little room. So I go in the little room, and they pick up the phone, and you listen to bidding, and you can bid. Okay, so I'm bidding, I'm listening, and all of a sudden they say, well, the bidding is going on, you haven't said anything. I said, well, I don't know if I want to do this or not. They said, well, you better bid soon or you'll be missing. I said, okay, here's my bid. And I put the bid down, and 1 second later they said, sold. I said, was there anybody else bidding? I don't know. So they came in and said to me, oh, you can go out and miss all the reporters there. We'll hide from who you are, or you can talk to reporters. And I went out and said, I'll tell them what happened. I want to make a down payment on my obligation to give back to the country for my good fortune, so I'm going to give this to National Archives, and it'll be there forever. And then I went that night to dinner, the Citicorp CEO's house. I said, I'm sorry, I'm late. I just had to buy the Magna Carta. He said, oh, sure. It was in the front page of the New York Times the next day, and he called me and said, David, I thought you were joking. Nobody ever come to my house and bought the Magna Carta before. So then I started getting emails, people saying, I have Magna Carta too. I have one. And I said, well, I have a standard letter. I don't want to corner the market in Magna Carta. So it's the only one in private hands, and it's in the National Archives. But then what happened is people offered me rare copies of the Declaration of Independence. I own now about 12 rare copies, and I think I lend them to the United States government. I lend my copies of the Declaration of Independence to our National Archives, the State Department, the Smithsonian. They don't have them for whatever reason. And then I bought rare copies of the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, the Bill of Rights, Constitution, and so forth. And then then there was an earthquake in Washington, D.C., and I called the head of the Park Service, who was on the Kennedy Center board, and I said, what are you going to do? He said, well, I'm going to deal with Congress. It'll take me a couple of years to fix it and get the money and all that. I said, well, I'll put up the money, forget the Congress. So I put up the money to fix the Washington Monument. I was amazed how many people thought it was an unusual thing. It wasn't that much money, relatively speaking, but I fixed it. And then I said, maybe I'll fix some other things. So the Lincoln Memorial, we're now fixing that, so it'll be open for the semi-quincentennial. We'll have an underground education center, the Jefferson Memorial, Monticello, Montpelier, the Custis Lee Mansion, Mount Vernon, and so forth. Why do I buy these documents, and why do I fix these? Let me explain. All of us are Homo sapiens. And Homo sapiens came out of caves roughly 400,000 years ago. And when they came out of caves, their brain was okay, but they didn't live that long. The average life expectancy 400,000 years ago was 20. Today it's 80s or so. But the brain developed over the 400,000 years to produce people like Einstein, Picasso, Shakespeare. Incredible what the brain has been able to do. And it's because of the development over 400,000 years. Some people are geniuses. But one thing the brain has not done is this. It hasn't yet gotten to the point where you see something on a computer slide that's a picture of Mount Vernon. It has the same impact on you as going to Mount Vernon. When you go to see a historic building or you go to visit a real historic document like the Magna Carta, it has a bigger impact on you. More likely you're going to read about it before you go there. More likely you're going to get a curator to tell you about it when you're there, and more likely you'll read about it afterwards. Now, why is that important? Right now, we don't teach history and civics very much anymore. The average person, the average college major in the United States is not a history major. About 1.5% of majors in college are history now. It used to be about 8%. Now it's 1.5%, because people are concerned about STEM, and people tell their kids, if you're not a STEM major, Johnny or Janie, you're not going to get to work for Goldman Sachs or Google. So everybody's a STEM major. The most popular major at Harvard is computer science. It used to be economics, but it's computer science. And so we don't know much about history. Now, the theory of history, as a famous Harvard professor famously said, those who don't remember history are condemned to relive it. So we need to get people to learn more about history. And here's an example of how bad it is. Is there anybody in this room is a naturalized American? Anybody? One. Okay, two. Okay. A naturalized American. To be a citizen, you have to be here 5 years, and you have to take a citizenship test. The test was varied over the years, but basically today, there's 100 potential questions you study for. You get 10 of them that they're actually going to give you. If you're 65 or older, they'll tell you which 10 you're going to get. And you have to get 6 out of 10 correct. 91% of the people that take that test pass. 91%. The same test was given to 3.5 million Americans born in this country, in all 50 states, about 2 or 3 years ago. And as you can see where I'm going, in only one state, Vermont, did a majority of Americans pass the basic citizenship test, which shows you we don't know much about history. The questions are, how many branches are there in the federal government? Who's the 16th president of the United States? Who was the general during the Revolutionary War? These are basic questions. So I do this in part because I want to educate people, and that's kind of why I do it all. Okay?
Now, some of the people in the audience have probably not seen the book yet, How to Invest, so I'm just going to give you a quick summary. It includes 23 interviews with major investors in categories that you define as mainstream investments, alternative investments, and cutting-edge investments. And we learn about major figures through your interviews who have invested in fixed income, private equity, real estate, hedge funds, venture capital, cryptocurrency, and more. I gathered from your introductions that you knew many of these people before you interviewed them, and I wonder if you were surprised by any of the things you learned when you did these interviews.
We were always surprised. You learned something, because many of these people are people that I knew. I hadn't interviewed all of them. I had interviewed some of them before, but I always learned something. But if you go back and look at their traits they have, and what do they have in common? They were very good students. They weren't high school dropouts. They were very good students, with very few exceptions. They were very good in math, very attentive to details, very control-oriented. They want to make all the final decisions, not good at delegating. They tended to be people that had great intellectual curiosity, wanted to learn and read about as much as they could about any subject. They are people that didn't want to make money just to make money because they could buy yachts. They wanted to do it because it was kind of a test of their wits, their skill set, and they just enjoyed ultimately just beating other people with their wits. In time, most of them gave away large parts of the money. And so those are the traits of some of the greatest investors we have. Warren Buffett is now 94 years old. I'm supposed to see him next month. He's coming for a video documentary of Katharine Graham, his good friend. And Warren, basically, from the time he was 12 or 13, wanted to be an investor. That was his whole life. He was very good in numbers, very good at math. He would have done more in this state, but he was rejected at Harvard Business School, so he went somewhere else. Just think if he had been going to Harvard Business School, what his career could have been. But in his case, he's a guy that just singularly is decided that he just loves reading annual reports, loves reading financial statements, and he's really good at it. He's not good at other stuff, he would say, but he's good at that. And those are the kind of characteristics you often see. He doesn't spend any money, he doesn't care about it really. He just, it's just different. That's what investors do. Like anybody who's a professional in art, that great artists, great performers, great athletes, they're so single-mindedly focused on what they do. They don't diversify and spread their talents other places. They go into one thing and they make themselves great at it.
So we're here at the Massachusetts Historical Society, which is focused on the history of New England. And for at least a century, New England was a great site of innovation, birthplace, you could say, of the American Industrial Revolution with its manufacturing of textiles, shoes, paper, wood, and so forth. And in the first decades after World War II, Some of that innovation continued. Route 128, many of you may know, was nicknamed America's Technology Highway. Today, with the exception of biotech, that prominence has faded, and other parts of the country, such as Silicon Valley, are known as the important sites of technological innovation, economic growth, population increase. We're losing population in Massachusetts in every census. So I'm wondering how you view New England as in its past and present as a site of investment.
Well, obviously, when the textile world was booming, New England was a great financial center. And then Boston became a center for financial money management, and spurred on by things like Fidelity. So Boston's strengths in the financial world have been money management, and I would say not hedge funds as much as traditional long-only management, and also been pretty good in real estate investing. What happened in Route 128 is that they got, I would say, they got too comfortable with themselves. With companies like DEC and Wang, when they were great companies, they didn't innovate. They didn't make changes all the time. They just stayed with what they had. And Silicon Valley stole the march and basically beat them. Also, in the early days, even MIT was not a place that encouraged people to drop out and build companies. Now MIT is great at that. But Harvard was a place where, Mark Zuckerberg dropped out of Harvard because they were going to throw him out if he kept, trying to build these companies. And Bill Gates dropped out of Harvard. And so a lot of people were not encouraged to do business things when they were undergraduates. There was no culture at Harvard to do that. There was a culture that developed much better at MIT for that, but other colleges in this region, Boston College, Boston University, Wellesley, Smith, other schools, they were not ones that encouraged people to become entrepreneurs and stay here. And so many people came here, they got educated, they left, and so Boston fell behind. Now I think it's still a great intellectual capital, obviously a great college town and so forth. It's now in biotech, it's with San Diego and Boston, probably the two leading biotech centers, and Boston's done a really good job of reinventing itself in the biotech area. I'm now on the Moderna board, and we're meeting, we have a board dinner tomorrow night, and Moderna's a great company, and there are a lot of others like that in this area. So I think Boston probably missed out on the Silicon Valley part, the semiconductor part, and a lot of the internet part. Their eyes were closed to it.
There's also the weather, but...
Well.
So another question I'd like to ask you is, over your lifetime, you've been a prominent actor, I think, in three realms. In the private sector, as co-founder and co-chairman of the global investment firm Carlyle Group. In the public sector, you told us about, I know you worked in the Senate, and then, of course, as that deputy domestic policy advisor for Jimmy Carter, and in the nonprofit philanthropic sector as a supporter and donor to many very important organizations, as we've discussed. I'd like to ask you how you would weigh the relative importance of these realms in making the United States as strong a society as it can be for all Americans.
I mean, the relative weight of...
to each other. Private sector, public sector, philanthropic.
Well,
Wait, can I say a few other things here before I turn it over to you? Some would argue that a flourishing private sector is all important, and that we'll see the kind of trickle-down effect. Others would insist that we need to strengthen the authority and impact of public and governmental institutions and programs. And people like you have devoted your time and resources to that third way, philanthropy, where private resources support public goods. So how would you calibrate the importance of these three sectors? And what do you think is the right balance and division of labor among them?
Well, the United States has been a capitalist country from almost the beginning. Our type of capitalism is different than European capitalism or capitalism in other places. I think we have a reasonably good balance, though we have income inequality, lack of social mobility, a lot of other problems. But you can have a very good lifestyle where there's much less private sector focus on and live in Europe. Europe is the greatest place in the world to live in the summertime. If any of you have ever been to the summer in the Mediterranean, the food is great, the water's great, it's everything. But Europe doesn't really lust after making money and building companies. For example, in all of your cases, how many of you, to get through a day, need a European technology to use? None. You have to use, to get through the day, you use about 6 probably different American technologies: Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Apple, so forth. You don't need any European ones. The Europeans missed the boat. As George W. Bush liked to say, the problem with the French is they don't have a word for entrepreneur. In France, you know, people take 2 months off for the summer. The obsession with becoming rich is not part of Europe, and it's a different lifestyle. And it may be get better. The highest percentage of happiness in the world, and the goal of life is happiness. As Thomas Jefferson famously said, what we want to have is the pursuit of happiness. He never defined it in the ensuing 50 years of his life, but happiness is what life is all about. And happiness without hurting other people by some other means, but happiness is what life is all about. And the countries with the highest happiness ratio are in Europe. Denmark, Finland usually lead the list. United States is, somewhere in the top 10 or 15, but not number 1 or 2. So if you really want to be happy, you can have the lifestyle and the social network of Denmark or Finland or another Scandinavian country. If you're obsessed with having material wealth and building something, the United States is a better capitalist form. The United States is also the largest philanthropic country in the world. We give away about 2.5% of GDP every year, which dwarfs any other country in the world. And the reason for that is this. When this country was started, we didn't have any money. And so Europe had churches and the government. They were finance libraries or government needed kind of functions or hospitals or whatever. And we didn't have that. Everything was a volunteer. When de Tocqueville came here in the 1830s, he said, "Can't get anybody to talk to me. Everybody's volunteering for things." Because we had volunteer libraries, volunteer fire departments, volunteer post office. We volunteered for things that was then it evolved in different types of philanthropy, though using your time is a very valuable part of philanthropy too. And so I think our country has a good mix, but it obviously not perfect for everybody. And so I would say the mix that we have here has obviously worked out reasonably well for me, but not for everybody. And we have a problem in this country. In 1936, the phrase was invented called the American Dream by a writer. And the idea was you can be an American and rise up from nowhere. And I believed in that, and many of you probably did as well. Now people don't live in the bottom part of our economic and socio-economic structure and believe in the American dream. The people that believe in it are the people who come from overseas. We have 49 million immigrants in this country. No other country in the world has anything close to that. Germany has 5 million. They're the second biggest with immigrants. We have 49 million immigrants. A lot of them are citizens. They came here because they believe in the American dream, and they often add a lot to our society. I believe in the American dream growing up, rightly or wrongly. I just thought if you work hard, you can get somewhere, and I'm sure many of you are in the same situation. So I wouldn't say our balance is wrong, but it's not as good as it could be because we don't have as much of a social net for some people, and I'm afraid that now we might be hurting the social net even more.
Okay. Now, the Carlyle Group has made its reputation through private equity, as I think most people probably know here. And we in Massachusetts, for months, have watched the collapse of the Steward healthcare system and the related hospitals. Much of that analysis has focused on the role of private equity for how it ran the hospitals with its laser focus on profit making. I should say that the Carlyle Group was not involved. Yes, I will make that clear. But there have been other cases of public criticism and anger towards investments of private equity, whether it was in nursing homes or veterinary hospitals, reshaping markets like sectors like housing, buying up large numbers of housing, and so forth. So I wonder if you could make the case to us for the value of private equity to society and the economy.
Well, private equity first arose in the late 40s in California when people coming back from World War II who were technology people, they wanted to build new technology companies. And they called it a new business, they called it adventure capital. Not venture capital, adventure, it was an adventure. And they cleverly said to their investors who were wealthy families, insurance companies, and banks, we're going to add value. We're not just picking stocks. We're going to add value. So we'd like a piece of the profits, 20% carried interest they got. Okay. And then when the private equity people came along with this idea of borrowing lots of money against the cash flow of a company and levering it up, they used the same 20% model. And this is built a gigantic industry in the United States. We dominate the venture capital and the private equity world, dominate it. And now there's another industry that's even bigger than both of them, and that's the private credit business. These businesses haven't grown because of the charm and good looks of the founders, as much as that charm and good looks is, irresistible, right? But it's because they've got good returns for their investors. And if you go back over the last 30, 40 years, in any given year, alternative investments, which is private equity, venture capital, growth capital, private credit, will outperform on average the S&P 500 equity index by 200 to 400 basis points. Now, for some people, 200 or 400 basis points isn't that much, but if you're managing a lot of money, that can be a lot. And so people are giving money to these firms because they get better rates of return. If you're in a top quartile private equity firm, you'll do much better, maybe 1,000 to 2,000 basis points better. So they're not perfect. Nobody's perfect in this world. Warren Buffett's had deals that went bankrupt. In fact, Berkshire Hathaway itself went bankrupt. So nobody's perfect. So yes, there are deals that have been done in hospitals that haven't worked out. There's some that have been done in hospitals that have worked out. So in any business, you have plenty of bankruptcies. In any given area, there's always bankruptcies. I think the statistics would show there are fewer bankruptcies in leveraged buyout related companies than there are in the regular economy. But somebody can maybe dispute that, but I think that's true. And so I'm not going to say every private equity deal is wonderful, and sometimes they put too much leverage on. When the private equity world first started, it's hard to believe, and I got into it because I read about one of the first deals. A guy named Bill Simon, former Secretary of Treasury, bought a company called Gibson Greeting Cards. And he bought it for, I think, $234 million from RCA, and he put in the end, $1 million of his own money. That's it. He levered it up 99 to 1. And if you lever something up 99 to 1 and the economy works out and you get out quickly, you make a lot of money. So he made $80 million on the $1 million investment, $80 million on one. Now today, you can't do that. Today you've got to put in about 50% equity or so to buy a company in a leveraged buyout. But for a long time, people were buying 1% equity, 5% equity. The famous RJR deal done in 1989 by KKR, they only put 5% equity in. Had they put in 20% equity, it would have made a lot more money because they had problems with the debt. But now I think the deals are pretty safe and much more secure. They're not perfect. But so my general view is private equity has some risk to it. It gets good rates of return. People should know what they're investing in when they invest in it, though.
And are there any areas you think should be off the table for private equity?
Well, there are many of them, but I would say private equity. Take nursing homes. We've had nursing homes, and it's a problem because nursing homes have one thing in common: the people using them will die, and then when they die, you'll get blamed for it. They're going to die anyway. But investing in, I don't really. We've invested in them. I don't want to do any more of them. Nursing homes, by definition, you're going to have people that are basically going to die, and you're going to be blamed for it if something goes wrong. So I would say nursing homes are not a great thing to invest in as a general rule of thumb. You don't want businesses that are unpredictable in their cash flow. You want something that's got a reasonable business model. But I just think that you have to structure the deal properly, make sure you know what you're doing. But I wouldn't say necessarily there's certain things that you shouldn't buy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I've been told I have one more question, and I couldn't not ask you this one, which is, after these interviews and your many years of experience, what your conclusions are about cryptocurrency. Your interviewees, I would say, divide into sort of three categories. Some people who just want nothing to do with it, others who have dipped a toe in, and some who have sort of jumped in with both feet. And so I'm wondering how you view, since this is sort of taking off in leaps and bounds, how you view it yourself, and whether your thinking has evolved over time. And whether, one last piece about it is whether one of the attractions, as you presented in the book, to many of the investors seems to be that it exists outside of government backing and regulation without any centralized administration. So you think that's a good thing? And where do you come out on this?
Well, I wish I had listened to my friends who were buying Bitcoin at 50 cents. And I made fun of them. I made fun of them at $100. I made fun of them at $500. I made fun of them at $20,000. I made fun of them at $60,000. So I missed it. And I had the attitude of most people my age, which is, this is, unreal. It's not a real asset class, and it could collapse immediately. Now, I think it's changed, and this is the reason. The President of the United States has got his own cryptocurrency of some type or another, and he's encouraging people to like cryptocurrency, and the SEC is now going to be very favorable to cryptocurrency. And the role it plays is essentially the role of that gold played for many years. It's different than gold. Gold has some metal value, but essentially, when Russia had sanctions against it because of the invasion of Ukraine, a lot of the oligarchs' money was frozen, and that made people around the world very nervous. Wait a second, you mean a government can freeze my money? I can't get my money? That's my money. They freeze it. So a lot of people said, I think I want to have something that the government can't take. Now, you could say that's not good because the government can't, get everybody's assets, and if they do something illegal, that's not good. But I'm just telling you, this is what a lot of people got very excited about. Secondly, a lot of people think the U.S. government has devalued and is in the process of devaluing our currency. We have $36 trillion of debt. We're adding about 1.8 to 2 trillion every year. We have the same debt to GDP ratio as Italy, 129%. And some people say, if I put all my assets in dollars and the dollar is ultimately going to go down, I'm really devaluing my assets. So people think that if they have a different kind of asset, it's not a bad hedge. So I think it's okay. The way I looked at it initially is sort of this. If any of you ever go to Las Vegas or wherever you can gamble, I guess you can gamble a lot of places these days, a lot of people, I lost a sports bet when I was in high school. They said that the Orioles couldn't win 4 games in a row against the Dodgers in 1966. I was wrong. I thought the Orioles couldn't win 4 in a row. They did. So I lost a bet. It was 18-1, and that was a lot of money for me. I swore I would never bet again, and I never have since high school. Never bet again. But there are people that have an obsession with betting. Sometimes they're addicted to it, or they just love it. If you love gambling and you go to Las Vegas and you say, all right, I'm going to lose 20,000 or 10,000 or 30,000, you get pleasure out of it. You get pleasure out of winning and losing, but you get pleasure out of playing the game. If it gives you that pleasure, fine. And I look at it the same way with crypto. If it gives you pleasure to own crypto and say I own Bitcoin, fine, but just recognize you might lose it eventually, and therefore don't put too much in, more than you can afford to lose. In crypto, the problem is it's like gambling. If you win $10,000 one night in Las Vegas, you're going to think, I'm a gambler. I'm really smart. I got to go back tomorrow. And the next day, you win another 10,000 and say, hey, I really am a genius. I should be in the World Series of Poker or something. Then you go back and you lose it all the next day. Casinos exist because people lose money, and not because people are winning money. So crypto, could implode, but at the moment, the zeitgeist of the era is more favorable to it than it was under President Biden. So I would say don't put too much in that you can't afford to lose. But if you want to be able to brag to your friends you have Bitcoin, then go buy Bitcoin. I mean,
okay. Thank you. Now we're going to turn things over to you, and if you have a question, you're going to go around with the microphone? So raise your hand if I see some hands back there.
Yeah, hi, Mr. Rubenstein. I'd like to ask you about your work with foreign
you're going to get a mic? I'm saying,
Wait,
go ahead,
wait.
get a mic.
Sorry. This question draws on your experience with the Council of Foreign Affairs. I worked with the U.S. Agency for International Development for many years. We know it's happening. We're not sure what's going to happen, but it's going to have to be reinvented at some time. So based on your experience, and particularly with your experience in the private sector, how would you reinvent something like the U.S. foreign aid program in
Reinvent.
years to
The
come?
U.S. foreign aid program, given current situation.
Well, I think isn't there somebody reinventing that right now? I interviewed over the weekend. I interviewed Elon Musk and his mother together. It was in a J.P. Morgan conference, and I've interviewed him before. He's an unusual guy, and what can you say? He's the richest man in the world, so he must know something. His mother is a model and dietitian. He makes a lot of speeches now. I asked him one question that he almost cried up. He almost teared up on it, I should say. And it's like he's paused for 30 seconds. And the question was this: most multi-billionaires, they buy yachts, they have artwork, they have lots of homes, they got lots of girlfriends, they got lots of these kind of pleasures. You don't have all that. Aren't you missing out on something in life by not having all these things? And he kind of sat there for 30 seconds and just said, maybe I am. Maybe I'm working too hard. Maybe I shouldn't be doing this. And it's like he's just, right now, he's driven to change things, and he's obviously the foreign aid program. How would I reinvent it? I don't know enough about it. It's obviously, you can go into any government program and find some fat. You can go to any place and find something you can cut. I'm not surprised they can find some place to cut. But the truth is, it's really something that helps the United States. I mean, we're giving foreign aid to people. Sometimes they're grateful, sometimes they're not. But I doubt that you can eliminate the entire program and think that's a plus for the United States. I don't see it. But there's a blunderbuss approach sometimes to some of these cost-cutting things, and that's what we're living through right now, unfortunately.
There's some more.
Really enjoyed all of your books, both on leadership as well as on how to invest.
Let me see.
Turn the mic on and answer the
What?
questions.
Just come up here. I mean, I can hear you better.
No, she got it.
Go ahead.
So, first of all, I've enjoyed all your books on leadership. I'm in the middle of this book, learning a lot. I think this question of curiosity to me was very interesting because it seems as if a lot of people that you interviewed all had a theme around curiosity. But my question is, what role does ESG play going forward? And what standards should
What role?
people that are
ESG, your environment,
consider
ESG.
Oh, see, ESG.
Yeah, your,
Okay. You know, there's certain words that are curse words in the United States, the F word or something like that. Well, ESG has become a curse word in the United States, not outside the United States. But today, if you say, I want to have a strong ESG program, people say, like, you're crazy. Like, I interviewed in the book, somebody built a strong ESG money management firm with Al Gore. And, today, though, because the administration doesn't like ESG, I think it's a factor that's not that well respected. But my own observation is that younger people ultimately will be the major buyers of things in the United States. And as younger people age, these are people that like ESG. They want a stronger environmental program, social program, governance program. And as they become bigger and bigger consumers, they will want companies that have good ESG programs. And so therefore, I think if you have a good ESG program, you'll eventually get more customers, and you'll probably have a better business. And in fact, if you look at some of the ESG funds, they've outperformed some of the non-ESG funds. But you're never going to convince people, Donald Trump or something, that ESG is good for business. But that's right now we're kind of in a same thing with DEI. DEI used to be something that everybody seemed to think had some merit, but now does not, in the view of many people who are running the country. So, go ahead.
Thank you for all your investments in history and historic institutions and so forth. Have you given any thought to how your outlook and your investments and so forth can inform perhaps some 20-somethings, 30-somethings that are billionaires in perhaps Silicon Valley and so forth? And second, does the 250th next year give us an opportunity to perhaps broaden the base of people who are investing in history?
Young billionaires. How can we get them to care more about these issues?
Well, on the 250th, we're going to celebrate that in a few years or so, and everybody's focused on it. There are many. I think many people should find some way in their own community, their own state, federal government, to kind of be involved in something that celebrates the 250th. Though it is interesting, we're celebrating the 250th because it's July the 4th, 1776. Now, as everybody who's a history person knows, we didn't actually sign the Declaration until August, and it wasn't a real country until we won the war, and that didn't happen until 1783, and we were governed by the Constitution, which didn't go into effect in 1788. So, but why do we celebrate this? Well, as you all probably know, there was a dispute for a while about this, but in July the 4th, John Adams wrote to his wife after we had the resolution to break away from England, and he said to Abigail, "This will be the most important day in American history, be celebrated for hundreds of years, the day we broke away from England, July the 2nd, 1776. So when July the 2nd, 1777 came along, they were in the middle of the Second Continental Congress, they're in the middle of fighting a war, and they forgot. They remembered the next day, they said, okay, let's celebrate on the 4th. They got around to it. And for the ensuing 50 years, John Adams was very upset that we were celebrating the 4th because that was symbolic with Thomas Jefferson having written that declaration. And Jefferson thought that was the appropriate date because he thought the Declaration was really more important than the actual vote. So, but I think more and more people should get involved in it. Young people, young billionaires, I'm a member of the Giving Pledge, and every time I try to say, why don't we have a gift to the country for the 250th anniversary, I don't get a lot of response. History-related stuff doesn't seem to evoke that much passion in people. They want to solve guinea worm in Africa, which is a great thing, and Jimmy Carter did it, but they don't seem to have the same love of American history that I wish they did.
What are the demographics of the Giving Group? Are there young people in it?
There are now. I mean, there are a lot of tech billionaires that show up. And I first went there the first time they started. I thought, okay, I'm going to meet these really impressive people. They built these gigantic fortunes. And you go there, and they look like, people that were not that kind of look like. When I go to a CEO conference, you CEOs, they're trim, they're well dressed, they're athletic looking. They look like these are people that are really impressive. When you went to see the Giving Pledge people the first time, I said, wow, people are out of shape, kind of older. They got some walkers or everything. They got kinds of that. I wasn't as impressed, but they have some younger people now, and a lot of tech billionaires who are some of these people are in their 20s or 30s. So they're different. And the biggest debate people often have is, what do you do with the money with your children? Because a lot of people say, do you ruin your children by helping them give away the money, or do you help your children learn about philanthropy by helping them give away the money? How do you deal with it? And it's a big issue, and obviously we all recognize that if you give your kids too much money, it's not likely to produce a great thing.
Okay, one more question, right up here.
Thank you so much for all that you had to say about investing. And we started the evening about Mr. Paine, about not profiteering, and you're a member of the Giving Pledge.
Right.
At what time do you start investing with the heart? And you decide that instead of the game of investing in money, that we're doing it for changing the social welfare of others.
What time am I investing for not profits but for other things?
Yeah, for the heart.
As a general rule of thumb, I mean, there's a thing called social impact investing, where you're looking for investments that will have a positive social impact. And there's some people that criticize that, say, look, make your money at getting the best legal investment you can, and then give it away the way you think it should be. So that's a different school of thought. That tends to be mine, which is say, I'm going to look for the best legal investments I can make without hurting people and so forth, but then I'll give away the money the way I want to. Social impact investing is more complicated, but some people do it, and there's some really good programs in it. It's not something I have pursued. I would say on investing, generally, for all of you who want to be investors, the key thing is don't do it yourself, because you're not going to be Warren Buffett. If you made a fortune in making widgets, you're not going to make a fortune in investing. It just doesn't happen. So take your widget fortune, find people that actually know what they're doing, give them the money, make sure you understand what they're going to do with it, the fees, make sure they have a track record, the people that produce the track record are still there, and get information from them on a quarterly basis, and make certain that they're doing something that's ethically appropriate for you, and you get realistic expectations of rates of return. If you give your money to somebody you expect to get 25% net internal rates of return, you're going to be very disappointed, because if they're doing it, it's going to be a fraud after a while. Nobody's going to do that consistently. But high single digits rates of return on a consistent basis is probably pretty good. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much. Can we give our speakers a hand, please? I think we all could have sat here a little longer to hear what our speakers had to say. Before we go, I, of course, would like to thank David and Liz for allowing us to join them in this stimulating conversation. My thanks as well to all of you in the room and watching online. I hope to see you back at the MHS sometime soon for one of our public programs or our upcoming exhibition, speaking of 250, 1775, Rights, Rebels, and Revolution, which opens on March 28th. Our official MHS kickoff to the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution will take place on March 11th at the Making History Gala, featuring Nathaniel Philbrick. So please visit our website or reach out to MHS staff for more information. And I will also say that David has graciously agreed to sign his book for us. So if you'll give us a few moments to whisk him out to the front lobby, he will be there to sign books for you. And I just want to say thanks again. Thanks
Thank
to our
you.
speakers.
So because we're in Boston, if I could just,
Yeah,
my two
absolutely, go
favorite
ahead.
Boston stories.
Go.
Number one, I have a program where I interview a historian in front of members of Congress once a month to educate members of Congress since they're making the laws. But one time I said I want to get somebody who wasn't a historian. I wanted to get the Chief Justice of the United States, who I know for a long time. It's John Roberts. And John Roberts said he would do it. He'd love to educate members of Congress how the Supreme Court works. So I began the interview and said, Mr. Chief Justice, did you always want to be, as a boy, Chief Justice of the United States? And he said, no. Well, did you want to be a judge? No. Well, did you want to be a lawyer? No. Well, what did you want to be? I wanted to be an American historian. All I cared about was American history. My father said, John, you'll starve to death. There's no money in being an American historian. No money. Be a lawyer. John said, I don't want to be a lawyer. So he went to Harvard and he majored in American history. Came back on the spring semester, got off at the Logan Airport, gets into the cab, says to the cab driver, please take me to Cambridge. And the cab driver said, oh, are you a student at Harvard? Yes, I am. What are you majoring in? Majoring in American history. Cab driver said, well, when I was a student at Harvard, that's what I majored in also. All right, so my other favorite story is, as you all know, at the Kennedy School, there's a thing called the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. And if you speak there, you have to answer questions from students. And one time they had a speaker named Mikhail Gorbachev. And Mikhail Gorbachev doesn't speak English, doesn't understand it, but he has his daughter as a translator. And so after he gave his speech, an enterprising student stands up and says, Mr. Gorbachev, how would the world have been different if Nikita Khrushchev had been assassinated in November 22nd, 1963, and not John Kennedy? How would the world be different? And without missing a beat, Gorbachev said, now, nobody can really know how the world would be different, but I can tell you for certain that Aristotle Onassis would not have married Mrs. Khrushchev.
I can't top that. So thank you and good night.